Hello, the focus of this video is trying to embed critical analysis into your literature review. And I'll begin with a bit of an overview of some ideas and show how this might weave in a bit of critical analysis and then give you some specific pointers here. So for a start, I'd always make a plan. And when I'm doing a literature review, I tend to tell a story from the broad to the specific. So what I'd do is I would begin with some context. Now, it's really important that you focus this, and in a sense, this is a bit of your kind of critical decision making. But you do want to get it sort of so it is quite focused on your study area, and you want to explain any key features of this context that are really important for your topic. Now, what I've done here is taken an example from some work that I've done in the past, and I've sort of shown how we've talked about the context. So this was actually a study which looked at smartphone use at events in about 2011, I think the study was undertaken. And so it was quite early days for smartphone use. And, what we talk about here was that obviously smartphone developers have got a range of functionalities that are relevant to event participants. And we've explained, obviously, that use patterns will vary, but they can be categorised into logistical, relational, informational, and mobile entertainment. So, there's quite a bit of analysis there that we've actually done in terms of, describing what these sort of features are and pulling out from, stuff about smartphones, what might be relevant in that kind of context. And then you're likely to want to start talking about a number of issues or theories, so this is kind of getting into the meat of your literature. And you want to, talk about what's known and how this applies to your context. And that's quite critical, so it's not just what do we know, it's what do we know and really why is this relevant to my study? So for instance here, this is not from my work, but someone else's, where they're talking about community events and how they're commonly used by local government and other stakeholders as a means to revitalise dying rural communities, and how these events become tourism products staged for commercial purposes. And thus they make substantial contributions to regional economies. So, they're not just describing community events, they're actually, sort of showing that they actually have this purpose in this particular context. They actually make a regional economic contribution. So there's a little bit of analysis going on there. And also they're kind of, showing the kind of relationship to the context of the study, which is all about community events. And then another thing you might do is analyse the context and the issue. So this is kind of, towards the end, what is known and what is not known. So what is your research gap? And what you tend to find is this will naturally feed into your methodology section. So, there's a comment here about the previous research, and how this shows that festivals can contribute to the development of bonding social capital, but they're less effective in building bridging or what's known as linking social capital. And then there's the kind of, so that's what we know. We know that, we've worked that out from the literature review. But, and it goes on to say, in the context of often smaller scale community festivals, there are few studies to inform this research. So actually we don't know much about what's going on there. And that's where our research gap lies. So another tip as well is organising materials. So sometimes students sort of say to me, well, I want to talk about 4 or 5 studies, and they just go through each study one by one. And that's something I've suggested you should avoid. That's much more like an annotated bibliography. But I've got a nice example here that shows how a number of studies are all mentioned in a couple of points. So for instance, here you can see, there's how many authors are there? 1, 2, 3, 4 papers have been referenced that refer to the costs and benefits of volunteering having been studied from an individual's perspective. So instead of going through each of those one by one, and saying Chinman and Wardersman, 1999, have talked about, volunteering from an individual's perspective. Faith et al., and you go on and kind of repeat the point. It's just all grouped into one point. And then you can see as well, we go on to make another point about from an organisational perspective. So I've sort of identified there's 4 studies that look at it from an individual volunteer's perspective, and then there's 2 studies that look at it from an organisational perspective. You might well go on and talk about some of the findings from these studies in more detail, but you don't need to keep repeating the point for each one. And going back to that in itself is a bit of critical analysis, because you've grouped them together. You've shown that there's 2 different perspectives, and you've grouped the studies by those perspectives. And then you can indicate if studies have different findings. So here, this was some work we did on disconnection, actually, at a campsite. So where people were turning off their smartphones while they were on holiday. And so, the first point is about, smartphones actually increasing people's ability to actually connect, and therefore they can engage in pre- and post-consumption phases of the tourist experience, actually while they're in the core consumption experience during tourism itself. And again, there's 3 studies there that refer to that. But then, Gretzel makes this other point that actually, because the tourism experience is altered by mobile devices, it can cause disengagement. So again, you actually sort of saying, well, we've got some slightly different findings here from one group of studies and then a different study. So a critical analysis and a literature review is not. So these are things which it's not. But you might actually include these in your literature review. So you will do these things, but this is not critical analysis. So just presenting facts about a topic, how many tourists visit this particular destination, the economic impact of a sport event, just giving those kind of facts. They're not analysis, not critical analysis. Describing the findings of a study, X found, and just giving us a list of what they found. Now, something here, stating something might be because. We want to actually try to interpret materials, but I would avoid using words like might and may. It just sounds very speculatively. I would do things like saying Brown 2016 suggests that, this is happening. So you avoid that kind of speculation. You put in the reference and you make that point clearly. And then just listing relevant studies. And again, sometimes you just get students sort of listing studies, but not sort of organising them and sorting them in some useful way. So what critical analysis might be is things like comparing different studies. So I've shown you some examples already. Explaining why a definition is relevant to your topic. So a classic thing that students do at the start of their literature review is go through a range of definitions. Can be really useful, but if at the end of that you need to actually tell us which definition is most relevant to your study and why. So rather than just listing a load of definitions and kind of going, oh, okay, so that was, just a lot of description, that doesn't really get you any marks. Quite young children at school can go and find materials and describe them and list them. What you need to do is explain from all of those definitions you've just gone through, which is the most appropriate for your study and why. Or maybe it's several of them, and maybe you're going to come up with your own definition based on those definitions for a particular feature of your study. Explaining why 2 studies have different findings. This is quite a useful thing to do. If you've got 2 studies and they seem to be looking at the same thing, but they found something different, why? I've got an example in a moment, for instance, related to social media use, which I think I've used before, which is that old people have a different way of using it compared to young people. So maybe the difference in your 2 studies is because they've got a different sample population in them. But explain that. Now, we want to give you your opinion, but we don't want you to use I think. We want you to give a reasoned opinion. So you could sort of say, based on the arguments of Robbins 2016, this indicates that. So you're building up your opinion based on what you've actually read, because it's a literature review. Okay, so that's why this is important here. A few more tips here. So the first one is relate material to your topic. So the first thing, the most easy thing you can do in terms of critical analysis is when you describe things like a definition, tell us why it's relevant to your topic. So I've mentioned this definition X is most relevant to pop-up experiential events because, I've got another one here, based on the motivational frameworks that have mostly been developed for other contexts. Social identity and experiential motives are most applicable to sporting events. And again, you might want to go on to explain why. So, it's really kind of taking that material beyond the descriptive to actually showing why it links to topics. And often when I read a draft literature review, I kind of go through and think, gosh, there's lots of interesting material here, but they haven't told me at all how it links to their topic. And I will go back to students and say, in each paragraph, can you just make a link back to your topic? That's a bit of critical analysis. I've said already, identify areas of controversy in the literature review. Okay, so, we've got another example here where Brown talks about work-based conflict in hospitality being centred on interpersonal relationships, while Smith found the conflict to be more task-based. And these are two different types of conflict, interpersonal and task-based. And actually, you've got two studies which have found different things. And then, you need to go and explain why those findings are different. And we often use the findings from one study to explain another. So a finding from one study might not make sense, and then you read something else and kind of go, oh, that makes sense now. I've talked about the currency, as in how dated something is, and by all means use older material, but explain why it's there. Why is that mobile media study from 2007 there, given that the technology has altered so much since then? Similar with relevance to your topic, when you're actually drawing on materials which weren't actually developed with anything to do with your topic area, why are they relevant now? I've also said something about who or what was studied, and this idea that, you study a particular group of people, it might not be relevant. So if you've been looking at young men's participation in sport, it's probably not going to be that relevant to older women's participation, and it's actually making that kind of thing clear. And then I've mentioned describing a theory and explaining why it's relevant to the study. So, for instance, last year I had a student who was looking at social media influencers, and she went back and looked at celebrity endorsement theory, and actually she in the end used a particular strand of that theory, which is celebrity brand congruency, and explained why it was relevant to social media influencers, because they are promoting brands that align to their lifestyles, and therefore this theory, which looks at how, the celebrity lifestyle links to the brand, was quite important. And then synthesize your findings. It's very important at the end of the literature review that you summarise what is and what isn't known, and identify areas of further research. And again, that's a good bit of analysis there.